Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're literally digging into one of the most gruesome and kind of forgotten economies in all of medical history, the body snatching trade. This was a time when the dead became a hot commodity, and the living were absolutely terrified of their own graves. I mean, just listen to the sheer confidence in that statement. That's a quote from Sir Astley Cooper, one of the most famous surgeons of his time. It's a boast that just perfectly captures the two things driving this whole story: incredible arrogance and, just beneath it, absolute desperation. So that's the big question, right? Why on earth would these brilliant, respected doctors start paying criminals to go out and desecrate graves? Well, the answer isn't just about some morbid curiosity. It all boils down to a brutal, simple economic problem: supply and demand. And it created a crisis that pitted scientific progress against public terror. Okay, so let's get into it. The entire problem really starts when this huge wave of scientific ambition comes crashing headfirst into the brick wall of a very, very old law. Think about it. The math was just impossible. On one side, you've got this explosion of medical schools and students who, actually need to work on real bodies to learn anything. But on the other side, the only legal supply came from executed murderers. We're talking a handful of bodies a year. And dissection wasn't seen as a gift to science. It was designed as a punishment, worse than death, a spiritual catastrophe that denied a person a whole body for resurrection. It just didn't add up. And, it's a basic rule of economics, right? When the legal supply can't meet the demand, a black market is going to pop up to fill that gap. This one just happened to be built on the recently deceased. And these guys, they weren't just some random ghouls with shovels. The resurrection men, as they were called, were professionals. They were organized gangs, often from the city's poorest neighborhoods, who saw a massive business opportunity. They basically created an entire illicit supply chain, complete with informants and a very particular grim skill set. So why take the risk? Well, look at this number. A single fresh body could pull in as much as 12 guineas. To a common laborer back then, that was an astronomical sum of money, maybe more than they'd see in an entire year. All of a sudden, the huge risk of robbing a grave starts to look like a pretty tempting bet. And their method, as you can see, was disturbingly efficient. They wouldn't even dig up the whole coffin. Nope. They just dig a narrow shaft right at the head, crack open the lid, and then use hooks to drag the body out. And here's the really clever part. They always threw the burial shroud back in. Why? Because of a crazy legal loophole. A corpse didn't legally belong to anyone, so taking it was a minor offense. But that cheap piece of cloth, that was property, and stealing it was a serious felony. But a business built on desperation and crime was only going to go one way. The profits were just too high, and digging up graves is hard, dirty work. So, what happens when these criminals figure out it's much, much easier to create a fresh supply of bodies than to dig for one? And this is where the story takes a truly horrifying turn. It happens in Edinburgh with two men, William Burke and William Hare. They weren't grave robbers. They were just lodging house keepers who made a chilling business calculation. Why bother with all the digging when there are perfectly good bodies right here? They developed this technique designed specifically for the anatomy market. They'd get a victim drunk, usually a poor lodger with no family, and then suffocate them in a way that left absolutely no marks of violence. The body was pristine, perfect merchandise. Their method became so infamous, it actually added a new verb to the English language, to burke, which means to murder someone quietly by suffocation. And you might think, okay, that was a one-off, a couple of monsters, but no. The same bloody business model started popping up in London with a gang that became known as the London Burkers. Their methods were a little different, using drugs and drowning, but the principle was the same. These cases in Edinburgh and London blew the lid off a terrifying reality. As long as a fresh body was worth money, the poorest people in society were literally being hunted. So you can imagine the panic, right? The public outcry was massive. People, especially the poor, realized they weren't safe, not even after death. And so they started to fight back, turning their own graveyards into makeshift fortresses. And you can see just how deep the terror ran by looking at the crazy defenses people built. You've got mort safes, these heavy iron cages locked over coffins. Graveyards literally built watchtowers for armed guards. Some people even used torpedo coffins, which were booby-trapped with explosives. And saddest of all, the poor formed burial clubs, pooling their pennies just so they could afford to hire a guard and make sure their loved ones actually rested in peace. And this really gets to the twisted, ugly heart of the whole thing. The people being snatched from their graves, and later the people being murdered, they were almost all poor. They were being treated as raw material, a resource, to train doctors who would then go on to serve wealthy clients, the very same people who could afford to protect their own graves with lead coffins and private guards. So finally, with all this public horror, the government had to step in. But their solution, well, it stopped the grave robbers, sure. But in a way, it just made the injustice official. It institutionalized the very same inequality that started the whole crisis. I mean, just look at how fast this all happened. We're talking about a 4-year window where these sensational murder trials created so much public pressure that Parliament had no choice but to completely change the law. The Anatomy Act was, you have to admit, kind of brilliant in a really cold, ruthless way. It completely destroyed the black market overnight by creating a free, legal supply of bodies. The question is, where did that supply come from? It came from the unclaimed dead, people who died in workhouses and charity hospitals with no family to claim them. In other words, the poorest of the poor. And the effect this had, it was absolutely chilling. The workhouse, already this place of absolute dread, suddenly got a new reputation. It became known as the vestibule to the dissecting room, the waiting room for the anatomist's table. For the poor, the law simply replaced the criminal's hook with the surgeon's scalpel. And you know, the deeper you dig into this trade, the more bizarre details you find. Like, get this, teeth were often worth more than the rest of the body. They called them Waterloo teeth because they were harvested from dead soldiers on battlefields and used to make high-end dentures for the rich. And the snatchers had their own slang. A corpse was a thing, and they sold children's bodies or smalls by the inch. So, this whole dark chapter, it really did force society to create the foundations of modern medical ethics. Ideas like consent and dignity and regulation. And today, yeah, we have digital anatomy and 3D printed organs, but the fundamental question, it's still here. Where does the material for medical learning come from, and who provides it? The shadows of the Resurrection Men are a powerful reminder that the price of knowledge can never, ever again be paid by the most vulnerable people among us.